The clock on my bedside table read 4:58 in the morning. The world outside was a silent blanket of blue and gray, the kind of stillness that usually feels peaceful. But that peace was shattered by a sound that made my heart lurch into my throat. It was not a soft tap. It was a rhythmic, desperate pounding on my front door. I sat up instantly, my breath hitching as the floorboards groaned under my feet. My mind raced through a list of nightmares. Was there a fire? Was it the police? I reached the hallway and peered through the security camera feed on my phone. Standing there, shivering despite the mild morning air, was my neighbor, Mr. Henderson. He was a man of routine, a retired history professor who usually kept his lawn manicured and his voice low. But the man on my screen looked like he had seen a ghost. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darting toward the street behind him. I unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open. Before I could even say hello, he grabbed my forearm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a man of 70. His voice was a jagged whisper. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Do not go to work today. Do not get in your car. Do not even open your garage door. Just stay inside and keep your curtains closed." I stood there, frozen, feeling the cold air seep into my bones. "Mr. Henderson, what are you talking about? I have a major presentation this morning. If I am not there, I could lose my position." He shook his head frantically, his face pale and glistening with a light sweat. He looked terrified. He leaned in closer, his voice barely audible over the morning breeze. He told me, "You have always been a kind neighbor to me. You brought me soup when I was sick. You watched my house. Please, for the love of everything you hold dear, just trust me this once." I asked him why. I begged him for an explanation. What was going to happen? Was there a threat? Was he in trouble? He looked at his watch, his hand trembling so hard he could barely see the dial. He looked back at me with a look of pure, unadulterated dread and said, "You will understand by noon. Until then, do not let anyone see your home." Then, without another word, he turned and practically ran back to his house, locking his door with a heavy thud. I stood in my foyer, the silence of the house suddenly feeling heavy and suffocating. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a reminder for my 6:30 a.m. commute. I looked at the dark street outside through the sidelight of the door. Everything looked normal, yet everything felt wrong. My gut was screaming at me to listen to him. There was something in his eyes that went beyond simple confusion or old age. It was the look of a man who knew a secret that was rotting him from the inside out. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee, but my hands were shaking so much I spilled half of it on the granite. I sat in the dark, watching the clock tick. 5:15. 5:30. Usually, by now, I would be backing out of the driveway. I thought about my boss, a man who valued punctuality above all else. I thought about the files sitting on my desk. But then I remembered the way Mr. Henderson had looked at the street. He was not afraid of me. He was afraid for me. I decided to wait. I told myself I would call in sick at 8. But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across my living room, I realized that the morning was eerily quiet. Usually, the neighbor across the street started his diesel truck at this hour. Today, there was nothing.
No barges, no engines, no wind.
Just the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I crept to the window and moved the curtain just a fraction of an inch. Mr. Henderson's house was dark, but I could see a silhouette standing behind his glass door. He was watching my house. He was waiting. I backed away, my skin crawling. What did he know that I did not? What was supposed to happen between now and noon? Every minute felt like an hour. Every creak of the house made me jump. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped by a warning I did not understand. I tried to convince myself he was just having a mental breakdown. Maybe I should call for help. But the conviction in his voice stayed with me. He said I would understand by noon. I looked at the clock again. 6:45. The wait was becoming a slow form of torture. I grabbed my laptop and tried to work, but the words blurred on the screen. All I could see was the terror in an old man's eyes and the crushing weight of a deadline I was about to miss. But little did I know, missing that deadline was the only reason I was still breathing. By 9 o'clock, The pressure in my chest was almost unbearable. My phone had been blowing up with texts and missed calls from my office. My manager, Marcus, was demanding to know where I was. I had sent a brief text saying I had a family emergency and would be offline, but he was not the type to accept excuses. I kept my phone on silent, the screen lighting up like a frantic heartbeat on the coffee table. I stayed away from the windows, sitting on the floor of my hallway where I could see both the front and back doors. I felt ridiculous, like a character in a low-budget thriller, yet the primal instinct to hide was stronger than my logic. I heard a car pull into the cul-de-sac. My breath caught. I crawled toward the front door and looked at the monitor. It was a black SUV with tinted windows. It did not belong to anyone on our street. It slowed down as it passed my house, almost coming to a complete stop. I watched the dark glass, wondering if someone was looking back at me. After a long, agonizing pause, the vehicle accelerated and turned the corner. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Was that what Mr. Henderson was afraid of? I wanted to call him, but he had told me to stay silent. I looked at the clock. 9:30. 2.5 hours until the deadline he had set. I began to pace the kitchen, my mind spinning. I started thinking about my life, my job, and my coworkers. I worked for a high-level logistics firm that handled sensitive government contracts. It was a high-stress environment, but I had never felt physically unsafe. Could this be related to work? I thought about the project I was supposed to present today. It was a massive overhaul of our security protocols and shipping routes. If someone wanted to stop that presentation, they would have a reason to keep me away. But how would Mr. Henderson know about that? He was a retired professor. He spent his days gardening and reading books on the porch. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. At 10:15, I heard a loud crash from the backyard. I jumped, nearly knocking over a vase. I rushed to the kitchen window and peered through the blinds. A large branch had fallen from the old oak tree, smashing into my patio furniture. It was just the wind, I told myself. But there was no wind. The air was dead still. I looked closer at the branch. It had been cut. The edges were clean, as if a saw had been used. My blood turned to ice. Someone had been in my yard. Someone was trying to see if I would come out. I retreated further into the house, locking the interior doors as I went. I felt like I was being hunted in slow motion. I went to my basement, the only place without windows. I sat on the cold concrete floor, my phone the only source of light. I searched the news for anything happening in our area. There were reports of a minor power outage a few miles away and a police standoff in the city, but nothing that explained why an old man would wake me at dawn to save my life. I looked at the time.
11 o'clock.
The countdown was reaching its final hour.
My phone buzzed again.
It was a message from a coworker, Elena. It just said, "Sarah, where are you? Something is wrong.
Please call me."
I started to type a reply, but then I remembered Henderson's words. Do not let anyone know you are home. I deleted the message and turned the phone off completely. The darkness of the basement felt like a heavy blanket. I listened to the sounds of the house, the settling of the wood, the hum of the water heater. And then I heard something else, a faint, metallic scraping sound coming from the floor above. It sounded like someone was trying to pick the lock on the back door. I held my breath, my lungs burning. I looked around for anything to use as a weapon. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight. The scraping continued for a few minutes, then stopped. Silence returned, more terrifying than the noise. I checked the time. 11:15. 45 minutes left. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own neighbor's making, and I still did not know why. I thought about the SUV, the cut branch, and the terrified look on Mr. Henderson's face. I realized then that he was not just a messenger. He was a shield. He had stepped out into the line of fire to keep me in the dark. I prayed that whatever was coming at noon would finally provide the answers I was dying for, or that it would pass me by entirely. I sat in the dark, clutching the flashlight, counting every second as the clock crept toward the moment of truth. The minutes between 11:15 and 11:59 were the longest of my life. I had moved back upstairs, hidden in the shadows of the laundry room which had a small, high window overlooking the street. I watched the digital numbers on my microwave clock flip with agonizing slowness. 11:57. 11:58. My eyes were glued to the street. At exactly 11:59, the black SUV returned. This time, it did not slow down. It parked directly across from my driveway, blocking the path. Two men stepped out. They were wearing dark suits and earpieces, looking like corporate security or something much more sinister. They did not head for my door. Instead, they walked toward Mr. Henderson's house. I wanted to scream, to warn him, but I was paralyzed. Just as they reached his porch, my phone, which I had turned back on in a moment of panic, began to vibrate violently. It was an unknown number. I answered it, my voice a trembling wreck. "Hello?" A calm, cold voice on the other end spoke. "Sarah, we know you are not at the office. We also know you are not in your car. This made things much more difficult for us." I did not speak. I could not. The voice continued. "You have something that does not belong to you. The encrypted drive you took home last night. We need it back. If you come out now, we can keep this professional. If we have to find it, things will get messy for you and your friend across the street." I looked out the window. One of the men was holding Mr. Henderson by the arm. The old man looked frail and broken, but he was looking directly at my house, shaking his head. He was still trying to protect me. Then it happened. At exactly 12 o'clock, a fleet of blacked-out vans swerved into the cul-de-sac from the opposite direction. They were not with the men in suits. These vans had government plates. Men in tactical gear swarmed out, weapons drawn. They moved with a terrifying precision. The men in suits tried to run, but they were tackled to the ground before they could even reach for their waistbands. I watched in total shock as my quiet suburban street turned into a war zone. One of the tactical officers approached Mr. Henderson, but instead of arresting him, he shook his hand. They spoke for a moment, and Henderson pointed toward my house. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint. The officer began walking toward my front door. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly, and went to meet him. When I opened the door, the officer did not point a gun at me. He showed me a badge. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said. "Miss, you are in grave danger. We have been tracking a corporate espionage ring within your company for 6 months. They realized you were the one who had the evidence they needed to stay out of prison. They were planning to intercept you on your commute this morning." I looked past him at Mr. Henderson, who was sitting on his porch steps, a bottle of water in his hand. He looked exhausted, but the terror was gone. The officer continued. "Mr. Henderson is a retired field agent. He has been working with us to monitor your safety since the threat level escalated last night. He was the only one close enough to warn you without alerting their lookouts. If you had left for work at 6 a.m., they would have forced your car off the road at the bridge. You would have disappeared, and no one would have known where to look." I felt a wave of nausea hit me. The bridge. My usual route. It was a secluded stretch of road over a deep ravine. They would have staged an accident. I looked at the clock. It was 12:05. The deadline had passed. I was alive because an old man had the courage to knock on my door at 5 in the morning and tell me a lie that was actually the most important truth I would ever hear. But as I watched the agents lead the men in suits away, I noticed something that made my blood run cold again. One of the agents was carrying a laptop bag from the back of the SUV. It was my bag, the one I thought I had left at the office. I realized then that the threat was not just outside. It had been inside my life for a long time. The hours following the arrests were a blur of statements, sirens, and flashing lights. I sat at my kitchen table, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, while agents moved through my house, checking for listening devices. They found 3. One in my living room, one in my bedroom, and one hidden in the frame of my front door. I had been living in a glass house, my every move monitored by people I thought were my colleagues. Mr. Henderson came over later that afternoon. He looked older than he had that morning, the adrenaline having finally left his system. He sat across from me and took a long sip of tea. "I am sorry for the scare, Sarah," he said softly. "But if I had told you the whole truth at 5 a.m., you might have panicked and tried to run. The only way to keep you safe was to keep you inside until the tactical teams were in position." I thanked him, my voice cracking. "You saved my life," I said. He just nodded, his eyes weary. It is what we do. Even in retirement, you never really stop watching the perimeter. As the investigation unfolded over the next few weeks, the true scale of the conspiracy came to light. It was not just a few rogue employees. My manager, Marcus, was the ringleader. He had been selling shipping routes and security codes to international cartels for years. The presentation I was supposed to give today would have exposed the inconsistencies in the logs that he had worked so hard to hide. They had planned to eliminate me and use the stolen drive to frame me for the entire operation. If I had died on that bridge, the police would have found the drive in my car and concluded that I was fleeing with the evidence. It was a perfect plan, ruined by a retired professor who refused to let a kind neighbor be a victim. I ended up testifying in a closed-door hearing. Marcus and 4 others were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. My company was liquidated, the scandal too great for it to survive. I received a significant settlement, but the money meant nothing compared to the lesson I learned about the world. It is a fragile place, held together by people who look out for one another in the shadows. I stayed in that house. I did not want to leave the man who had saved me. Mr. Henderson and I became close friends. We would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down. He never talked much about his days in the bureau, and I never asked. We just enjoyed the silence, a silence that was finally peaceful again. One morning, exactly 1 year after the incident, I woke up early. The clock read 4:58. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. It was a quiet, blue-gray morning. I saw Mr. Henderson in his garden, tending to his roses. He looked up and saw me. He offered a small, knowing wave. I waved back, a tear pricking my eye. I realized then that every day I woke up was a gift from a man who knew the value of a single hour. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee, the sound of the machine the only noise in the house. I was no longer afraid of the dark or the secrets it held. I knew that as long as we watched over each other, the light would always find its way back. The world is full of threats, but it is also full of heroes who do not wear capes. Sometimes, they just wear old cardigans and knock on your door at 5 a.m. to tell you to stay home. And if you are lucky, you will have the wisdom to listen. I took a sip of my coffee and looked at the clock. It was 6:30 a.m. My old commute time. Instead of driving toward a trap, I sat down and began to write. I wanted to tell the world about the neighbor who saved me and the noon that changed everything. Because sometimes, the most terrifying words you will ever hear are the ones that save your soul. I looked out at the roses one last time and smiled. I was safe. I was home. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood why.